So that's the last lesson I wanted to get to. There was a lot of content that was compressed into a few slides there. So I'd really like to talk to people later or answer any questions now if there are any. Thanks.
Okay, so we have time for maybe one or two questions. Let me step over these cords.
There are suggestions for security on ISO 18006, so not on the, it's compatible to Gen 2, but it's the ISO standard.
Mm-hmm.
Did you follow these suggestions for your protocol, for your security considerations, or do you know them? That's ISO working item, I think, and it defines a security layer on above Gen 2.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be interesting for you, for your considerations.
Yeah. No, we didn't. I mean, so we were working with fairly, we know that the read command is not fully implemented, for example. So we were really, I don't want to call it a hack because that's kind of a dirty word, but we kind of had to hack a lot of this stuff on top of the existing, query, Pacquiao response into the ID field, and so on. So we're not really close enough to the full Gen 2, experience to do that.
And concerning the side channel analysis attacks, so we did already attacking tags. Adi Shamir did attacks, and I'm pretty sure that it's also possible or even easier to attack WISPs because of the backscattering. And so we should do that actually.
Yeah, I think side channel attacks are a very big risk, especially if we're claiming that we can do security stuff on a WISP.
Yeah, as soon as there is no security on them, it's not a problem. But I think when you start with putting encryption on them, it's...
Yeah, I mean, I want to see it actually done. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to see some side channel attacks on this, but at least there's a little bit of security. Any other questions before we move back to Michael? Oh, one more question.
So in your talk, you mentioned, I'm not a WISP user, but I wonder, looks like there is a supercapacitor to store energy. So how do you, as a programmer, how do you ensure you will not overrun energy or cause it to die for a while, then recharge? I'm
sorry, you said you're not sure how are you?
Looks like WISP has a supercapacitor with buffer energy, right? So how as a software program, how do you know you will not overrun energy doing computation or transmission?
Right. So actually, So those the figures that I gave were for I think WISP Rev 4 prototypes that did not have a supercapacitor, but that had this small capacitor. A supercapacitor is actually much more than 10 microfarads. That was just a little capacitor that comes on the WISP. I'm sorry to introduce confusion there.
My question is how, like you write a software, right? You do radio transmission, you computation. How do you know you will not run out of that little energy and it goes die, then recharging up?
How do you know you're not running? How do you know you're not running out of energy? Right. So that's one thing that this Memento system that does execution checkpointing tries to do at runtime. Right. So it can use measurements from the ADC. It can measure the WISP's own voltage in order to try to predict fuzzily whether it's going to die soon. Sure. Hardware to measure voltage, or to send you interrupts when certain thresholds happen at a fine resolution would be nice too.
Go right now to Michael, and he'll finish up this session.
Okay. Is my mic on? Yeah?
Doesn't your talk kind of address that question, right?
Yeah, well, actually, that was great. So, by the way, you can sample, the WISP can sample its own voltage, which is actually going to be pretty key to this talk. I'll give more details about it. So what I'm looking at is building an energy-aware scheduler that runs on the WISP so that you can schedule the idea is that it can schedule any feasible RFID program, which is basically if the WISP can possibly store enough energy to execute a given task, it will be able to execute it, and we'll be able to figure out all of that automagically. So there's been a lot of computational RFID applications. You guys have heard a lot of them today. And check out Shane's CRFID resources webpage, has links to pretty much everything that's been done. What we've been looking at recently is activity recognition, which I talked about really briefly at the Minutes of Madness. But what makes this application a little bit different is that we're using tens of tags at greater than 10 feet. So we had some pretty good results, but what we want to add to that is crypto, so that someone can't stand outside and actually figure out what someone is doing by having a reader outside the house. And second, what we want to do is increase the sample rate from 1 sample per second to closer to 10. But to do that, we need to use the Gen2 read command so that we can actually get rid of some of that MAC overhead. So we did implement the full read command, so that is, we haven't pushed it back into the tree yet, but it does exist now if people want to use it. But the problem with this is that this 2-volt wake-up threshold that we talked about in the tutorial, that's optimized for returning the sensor value in the ID field. But it doesn't really work for general purpose tasks because what happens is, well, actually, let's just go to the graph. So the dashed line shows the receive power according to the Freeze equation. So you can see that it drops off exponentially with distance. And it shows the samples per second for the query command and the read command. So if you look at the query command, it can function all the way out to 3.75 meters, which is great. That's what that 2-volt wake-up threshold was for, is that query command. But if you look at the read command, it stops working at only 2 meters. And this isn't because there isn't enough energy. It's because when it wakes up at 2 volts, there's not enough energy at 2 volts to begin executing. But if you would have charged the capacitor higher than 2 volts, that read command can actually complete just fine. There's plenty of energy, but the default scheduler just isn't really making good use of the available energy. So as I said, what we did is developed an energy-aware scheduler, so where the WISP should automatically be able to schedule any feasible task without knowing how high it needs to charge that capacitor. So to do this, our scheduler determines what voltage to charge to before beginning the execution of a task. And second, it determines how long it needs to sleep to reach that target voltage. Because now, since we want to wake at different voltages, just not 2 volts, we can't use the hardware supervisor to automatically wake us up. We actually have to use this voltage sampling to get to whatever our target voltage is. The result is that we could nearly double the operating range of that read task, but we could do this while still having a minimal impact when running the query command. So I did want to take a brief detour here into debugging tools. One thing that was very helpful is using the USRP to actually capture the reader and tag signals. So one thing that I'll talk about a little is we actually implemented the full Gen 2 protocol and the full read command. But to be able to do that protocol debugging was very helpful to see exactly what the reader and the tag were doing at the same time. So you can just capture with the USRP, plot it in MATLAB. The second one, Dan had talked about during the Minutes of Madness, which is this custom-built WISP monitoring board that Richard Prashad made. So the keys here is that you can attach the debug pin and the voltage pins of the WISP, and you can transmit changes in that data to the PC. But this doesn't consume or add any energy to the WISP. So what you get is you can get a live trace of what the WISP is doing over the order of minutes if you want. You just capture all the data on the PC. And some of the graphs later will show the data that we got from this. So to understand this work, I need to go over a little bit about the energy model of how this works, of how the WISP works. So first is storing energy. So we're talking about, we can charge this capacitor. But depending on what your received power is, the rate that the capacitor charges is going to change. Actually, the time will change over the order of magnitudes. So at 1 meter, you can charge from an empty capacitor to a full capacitor in about 100 milliseconds. But only at 1.5 meters, it now takes about 400 milliseconds. So we have to be able to deal with. So when we're trying to decide how long do we need to sleep, we need to be able to do this in the face of wildly varying input powers. The second thing is that the maximum voltage is dependent on your input power as well. So if you look at 4 meters, it never charges above 1.5 volts. And the WISP actually powers up at 1.5 volts, and what we found is that it can execute perfectly fine at 1.5 volts. You don't actually need to be at 1.8 volts. And the last thing about this input power is multipath, which Ben mentioned. It actually drastically affects what your received power is. And in the US, these readers are changing frequencies every 400 milliseconds. So you can end up getting radically different input powers that changes every 400 milliseconds, and the channel hopping is random. So you never know how much energy you're going to be having. You never know how quickly your capacitor will charge. Second thing is consuming energy. So what this plot shows is when we just transmit continuously, which is just backscattering, just dummy data, or receiving, we plot with the capacitor voltage, how quickly it drops off. And the last line is the sampling the accelerometer. The first thing to notice is the x-axis. We're talking about 10